Step into the world of Sherlock Holmes stories, your gateway to enthralling audio mysteries. Unravel the chilling enigma of cry heard under the ice and lose yourself in an unforgettable listening journey. Chapter 1. The Cry Heard. Under the ice, it was a bitterly cold winter evening when the case first presented itself. A dark, chilling night that seemed to carry the weight of something mysterious in the air. The London fog hung thick, clinging to the cobblestone streets, muffling the sounds of carriages and the occasional passing footstep. Inside our familiar Baker Street apartment, the warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the frost that covered the window panes, and yet there was no peace to be found. I had just returned from a long day at the clinic when I was greeted by a sight I had come to recognize all too well: Sherlock Holmes, sitting in his usual spot by the fireplace. His sharp eyes focused on a series of papers he had spread out before him. His brow was furrowed in concentration, and though he hadn't yet acknowledged my presence, I knew that a new puzzle had presented itself. "Holmes," I said, placing my hat and coat on the nearby rack, "I trust you've been busy." He didn't look up immediately, but the faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Busy?" he echoed, his voice rich with that familiar mixture of confidence and curiosity. "Indeed, Watson, there is nothing more satisfying than the thrill of a new mystery, especially one that has yet to unfold fully." I took a step closer, observing the papers before him. They were a collection of letters and a map, a few sketches scribbled hastily in the margins. Something about it was immediately intriguing, though I couldn't quite place why. "What's this about?" I asked, settling into the armchair opposite him. Holmes set down his pipe and leaned forward, gesturing to the letters. "A most curious case, Watson. One that, I believe, will require all our faculties to unravel. It involves an incident at a remote country estate north of the city, near the small village of Ashcombe, a case of unexplained death, a frozen lake, and a cry heard under the ice." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the peculiar combination of elements. A cry heard under the ice? That sounds like something out of a ghost story. Holmes gave a short laugh, clearly amused. "Not at all, Watson, although it is quite remarkable. A woman, Clara Davis, was found dead on the edge of a frozen lake last evening. The cause of death is unclear, though it seems obvious enough that she fell through the ice. Yet the strange part is the fact that several people in the village claim they heard a cry shortly before the incident. A cry so loud and distinct that they were certain it came from beneath the ice itself." I leaned forward, intrigued by the layers of this unusual story. "A cry from beneath the ice? How do they explain that?" "Ah, therein lies the mystery," Holmes replied, his eyes lighting up with the anticipation of the puzzle. "The villagers are split on the matter. Some claim it was the victim herself, a final scream as she plunged into the water. Others insist it was someone, or something, else entirely. A voice not of this world, calling out from under the ice, a harrowing suggestion. But there is something in the way they speak that suggests they may know more than they're letting on." Holmes stood up and began pacing, his long strides adding to the tension of the room. "There is no rational explanation for such an occurrence, Watson, but that does not mean it is without reason. Every clue, every detail must be carefully examined. What caused this woman's death? Why was she near the lake in the first place? And why would anyone claim to have heard a cry when none should be possible?" The questions hung in the air, and I felt the weight of the case press down on me as Holmes's mind worked through the possibilities. "You're going to investigate this, then?" "Of course," Holmes replied, pausing in his pacing to look at me with a sharp glint in his eye. "I've already made arrangements to travel to Ashcombe tomorrow. I'll need your assistance. Watson, as always, we must get to the bottom of this before the situation escalates further." I nodded, sensing that this would be no ordinary case. There was something far deeper at play here, something that Holmes had already seen, but I had yet to understand. The cry under the ice was not merely an oddity. It was a key, a clue, something that would lead us to the truth. That night, as I prepared for the journey ahead, I couldn't help but feel the excitement of a new case, the anticipation of following Holmes as he unraveled yet another knot in the fabric of a mystery. But I also felt the lingering unease, the sense that we were walking into something that had already been set in motion long before we arrived. The next morning, we set off for Ashcombe, the journey taking us through the winding roads and snow-covered countryside. The chill in the air was biting, but I knew that our destination would bring more than just the cold. It would bring us face to face with a death that had left behind more questions than answers. As we arrived at the estate where Clara Davis had met her tragic end, I was struck by the isolation of the place. The house stood at the edge of the village, an imposing stone structure with tall windows that seemed to watch us as we approached. The lake, which had been the site of the tragedy, lay just beyond, its surface smooth and untouched by any sign of the incident that had taken place. There, Holmes, ever observant, immediately began his inspection. He seemed to take in every detail, the way the snow had been disturbed around the lake, the position of Clara Davis's body when she was found, and the accounts of the witnesses who had claimed to hear the cry. After speaking with a few of the villagers, Holmes turned to me, his expression contemplative. "There is something off about this case, Watson. There are too many inconsistencies in the story. The cry, the positioning of the body, the reluctance of the villagers to speak openly. They know more than they are letting on." I nodded, fully aware that this was only the beginning. Holmes had already begun to piece together a narrative, but there was still so much left to uncover. Why had Clara Davis been at the lake that night? What had truly happened to her? And who or what had made the cry beneath the ice? As we stood by the frozen lake, I couldn't help but wonder if the answer lay beneath the surface. It was clear that this would be no ordinary investigation, and the cry that had echoed through the night would be the key to unlocking everything. Chapter 2. The Cry Under the Ice. The wind howled as we stood at the edge of the frozen lake, the chill cutting through our coats and seeping into our bones. The village of Ashcombe lay behind us, its quaint cottages clustered together like scattered pebbles on the hillside. The quiet was almost oppressive, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes had been deep in thought since we arrived. His sharp eyes scanning the scene with the others could not even begin to comprehend. "Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely rising above the wind. "What do you make of it all?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down by the edge of the lake, his fingers brushing lightly over the snow-covered ground, examining the faint markings left behind by the previous evening's tragedy. The ice stretched out before us, its surface smooth and unmarred, the kind of cold perfection that could easily hide the most disturbing of secrets. "I see no signs of struggle," Holmes said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "No footprints leading to or from the lake. And yet, Clara Davis was found, here by the water's edge, with no apparent cause of death other than drowning. Then what could have happened to her?" I asked, my thoughts still swirling around the strange circumstances of her demise. How could she have fallen through the ice without leaving any sign of a struggle? Holmes stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the frozen expanse. "That is the first mystery, Watson. The ice here is thin, too thin to support someone's weight for long. If Clara Davis had fallen through the surface, there should be signs of her attempts to climb out, signs of distress. Yet there is nothing, no broken ice, no marks in the snow. It is as if she simply disappeared beneath the surface without a sound." I frowned, turning my gaze towards the frozen water. The quiet of the scene was unnerving. There was something unnatural about it, the stillness that hung in the air, the lack of any traces of a struggle. Perhaps the cry they heard was her final attempt to call for help, I suggested, trying to make sense of the strange reports from the villagers. Holmes shook his head. "I doubt it. If she had been able to cry out, someone would have heard her. The villagers live close to the lake. A sound like that would have carried across the still night air." "No, Watson. The cry they heard was not from Clara Davis." The realization sent a chill through me. If Clara Davis hadn't been the one to cry out, then who or what had? Holmes seemed to read my thoughts, his expression grim. "It's possible that someone, or something, was trying to warn her, Watson. Perhaps she wasn't alone on that ice." I shivered at the thought, the coldness of the night air creeping into my skin. But why? Why would anyone want to hurt her? She was a well-known figure in the village, respected by many. What motive could there be? Holmes turned back toward the mansion-like house that had once belonged to Clara Davis's family. It stood at the far side of the lake, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The air seemed heavy with secrets, and I could tell that Holmes's mind was already moving ahead, processing the information we had gathered. "We'll need to speak to the people who knew her best," Holmes said finally, his voice resolute. "But there's more to this than just a tragic accident. The cry under the ice is no mere coincidence. There is something at play here, something that runs deeper than a simple drowning." I nodded, sensing the gravity of the case. We had only begun to scratch the surface, but already I could tell that this would be one of Holmes's most complicated investigations. It was no longer just about solving a death. It was about uncovering a hidden truth that someone was desperate to keep buried. We made our way back toward the village, the cold air biting at our faces as we walked in silence. Holmes's mind was clearly elsewhere, lost in thought as he mentally pieced together the clues. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, the connections being made, the deductions forming behind his sharp eyes. When we arrived at the village inn, the warmth of the fire felt like a welcome relief from the cold, but the conversation that followed was anything but comforting. Holmes sat with me at a corner table, his attention focused on the gathered villagers, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Most of them seemed reluctant to speak, their eyes shifting nervously as they recounted the events of the previous night. The details were hazy, but there was one thing they all agreed upon: the cry. "The cry came from the lake," one man said, his voice trembling. "We heard it clear as day, loud and desperate, like someone calling out for help. But by the time we reached the shore, there was nothing there, only the ice, and then Clara Davis was gone." "I've lived here my whole life," another villager added, his voice shaky. "I've never heard anything like it. It wasn't like a normal cry, it was almost unnatural, like it wasn't from a person at all." Holmes listened intently, his gaze scanning the room. He took in every detail, every nuance of their words, analyzing the smallest shifts in their body language. He didn't miss the unease in their voices, the reluctance to speak of what they had truly heard. "You are certain of what you heard?" Holmes asked calmly, his eyes narrowing. You are all sure it came from the lake?" "Yes," the man replied, his eyes wide with fear. "We all heard it. We couldn't explain it. But it came from the ice. I swear it." Holmes sat back, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of his chair. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. A realization, perhaps. I could see that he was connecting dots that I had yet to understand. "It seems, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "that the cry heard under the ice is no ordinary sound. It was a signal, something meant to draw attention, but who or what was behind it remains unclear." I leaned forward, my thoughts racing. Could it have been an animal? A creature trapped under the ice? Some kind of wild beast? Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. This was deliberate. This cry was not made by an animal, but by someone, or something, who knew exactly how to create fear in those who heard it. Whoever is behind this is sending a message, and Clara Davis was their target." I sat back, stunned by the implications of his words. It was clear now that this wasn't just an accident. The cry under the ice was part of a much larger plan that had yet to fully unfold. Holmes's mind was already working through the possible scenarios, and I knew that sooner or later he would have the answers. But for now, we could only wait and watch as the case continued to unravel before us. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. The morning after our interview with the villagers, Holmes and I made our way to the mansion where Clara Davis had lived. It stood just beyond the edge of the lake, its grandeur now lost beneath the weight of years and neglect. The once pristine windows had dulled with grime, and the ivy that climbed the stone walls appeared as though it had been left unchecked. The mansion, like the mystery surrounding Clara's death, seemed forgotten, a relic of a past that had somehow been overshadowed by the events that had transpired here. Holmes moved swiftly, his coat billowing behind him as he approached the large wooden doors of the house. Without hesitation, he knocked, the sound echoing across the empty courtyard. The door was opened by a butler, his face creased with age and his eyes shadowed with some unspoken burden. He greeted us with little more than a stiff nod, leading us inside without a word. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said quietly, his voice deep and formal. "You're expected. Please, come in." The interior of the mansion was just as I had imagined. Dark and cold, with furniture draped in white sheets. Abandoned as if frozen in time. There was a distinct mustiness in the air, the scent of old wood and untouched rooms. But it was more than just that. It felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes, of course, was already lost in the details. His eyes darted from the grand staircase to the fireplace, from the dusty paintings hanging on the walls to the glint of something metallic hidden in the shadows. Nothing escaped his scrutiny, and I knew that the answers to Clara Davis's death lay somewhere within these walls. As we followed the butler deeper into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking through a place that had been carefully preserved, as if someone had made sure that the rooms remained untouched, kept in a state of deliberate stasis. It was a curious thing. Why would anyone do that unless there was something here worth hiding? The butler led us into the drawing room, a large space with high ceilings and walls adorned with dark oak paneling. The furniture here, unlike the rest of the house, was covered in rich velvet cushions and tapestries, as though the room had been maintained for show rather than actual use. In the center of the room sat a long table, and it was here that Holmes's sharp eyes immediately alighted upon a particular item. A small, intricately carved box, placed carefully in the center. Holmes walked over to the table, his fingers brushing lightly over the box's surface. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a sense of purpose. The butler hesitated before answering, as though considering how much to reveal. It was Clara's. She kept it in this room, close to where she worked. It's where she kept her most personal items. He looked at Holmes, then at me, his expression guarded. "But I can't say more. You'll have to ask the master." "The master?" I asked, momentarily confused. "Yes, sir," the butler said, nodding toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. "Mr. Charles Davis, Clara's brother. He's been away for some time, but he returned earlier today. He's the one who might have answers about the box and other things." Holmes's gaze flicked toward the hallway with a knowing look. "We'll speak with him then." We followed the butler down a dimly lit corridor to a smaller room at the back of the house. This room was smaller than the drawing room, but far more lived in. The desk was cluttered with papers and old books, and a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. At the far side of the room stood a man who must have been Charles Davis, a tall, lean figure dressed in dark, expensive clothes. His sharp features were clouded with fatigue, and his eyes, though intelligent, carried the weight of something troubling. "Mr. Davis," Holmes began, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We're investigating the death of your sister, Clara." Davis looked up at us, his expression hardening slightly, though it quickly softened. He seemed unsure of how to react. A man caught between grief and something else, something hidden beneath the surface. "I'm sorry, but I've already spoken with the authorities," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "What else is there to discuss?" Holmes didn't waver, his eyes fixed on Davis with a piercing gaze. "There is always more, Mr. Davis. Clara's death is no ordinary accident. The circumstances are unusual, and we need to understand why she was at the lake, why no signs of a struggle were found, and most importantly, what role you played in all of this." Davis stiffened, but before he could respond, Holmes moved toward the desk, his attention focused on the papers spread out before him. His hand brushed across the papers, seemingly searching for something specific. After a moment, he picked up a small, folded letter and read it briefly before turning to Davis. "This letter," Holmes said, holding it up for Davis to see, "was found among Clara's belongings. It seems she was corresponding with someone, a person you knew well. But the handwriting, it's unfamiliar. Perhaps you can explain who this person is." Davis's face shifted, and for a brief moment I could see a flicker of something. Fear, guilt, perhaps, cross his features. He swallowed before speaking. "I don't know what you're talking about. My sister, Clara, was a private person. She kept to herself." Holmes's sharp gaze didn't waver. "But this letter, Mr. Davis, it mentions something that Clara was planning to reveal. It speaks of a secret. Something hidden under the ice." The tension in the room thickened, and I could see Davis's knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of the desk. "I've already told you everything I know," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't know anything about a letter. I don't know who Clara was writing to." Holmes stepped closer, his presence commanding. "Perhaps it would help if we spoke to the person who wrote this letter. Clara's secrets were not just her own. They are tangled in something much larger. And you, Mr. Davis, are at the center of it." Davis's jaw clenched, and he stepped away from the desk, his movements suddenly defensive. "I have nothing more to say," he muttered. "You have your answers. You'll find no more in this house." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "The truth is out there, Mr. Davis, and soon you will have no choice but to face it." Davis turned his back to us, walking toward the far corner of the room. Holmes, ever observant, seemed to make a mental note of this, his eyes darting to the pile of papers on the desk once again. There was something about the way Davis had reacted that suggested more. Something hidden beneath the surface, just waiting to be uncovered. As Holmes and I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of something far larger than a simple drowning. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they were scattered, incomplete. The letter, the mysterious cry under the ice, Clara's secrets, it was all connected. But how? "Holmes," I said as we made our way back to the foyer, "do you think Davis knows more than he's letting on?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were distant, as if he were already piecing together the next steps of the investigation. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Davis is hiding something, Watson, and the key to this case lies within the secrets he's so desperately trying to protect." The investigation had only just begun, and I knew that we were far from uncovering the full truth, but I also knew that Holmes, with his unparalleled deductive mind, would soon connect the dots, no matter how elusive they seemed. The tension had settled over Ashcombe like a thick fog. Holmes and I spent the next few hours walking the village's narrow streets, speaking with the townspeople, and gathering what little information we could. Each interaction left me with more questions than answers. The villagers were tight-lipped, as though some unspoken rule governed their silence. They knew more than they were willing to reveal, and it was clear that Clara Davis's death was not merely a tragic accident. It was part of something far more complex, far more dangerous. Holmes seemed to sense it too. His sharp eyes darted from one person to the next, observing the smallest details. Every shift in body language, every hesitation in their speech was catalogued in his mind. I could see the gears turning in his head as he pieced together the subtle clues. But as always, he kept his deductions to himself. Our next stop was the village inn, a small, modest building nestled at the edge of the square. It was warm inside, the hearth crackling with a steady fire that brought a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The innkeeper, a stout man with a thick beard, greeted us with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Good afternoon," Holmes said smoothly, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're here to speak with the locals about Clara Davis. I trust you know her well." The innkeeper hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward the far end of the room where a few villagers sat in quiet conversation. Holmes's presence, as always, was enough to make anyone uneasy. His reputation had a way of preceding him. "Clara, the innkeeper said reluctantly, wiping his hands on a towel. "She came here often, but not for company. She preferred to keep to herself." "What happened to her?" "Well, it's not easy to speak of, but if it's answers you're after, you'll have to speak to the others." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And who, may I ask, are these others?" The innkeeper shifted uncomfortably, casting another quick glance at the patrons in the room. "There are a few who knew her better than others. The mayor, for one. And there's also Miss Clara's cousin, Evelyn. She was always in and out of the house." "Thank you," Holmes said curtly, his gaze never leaving the innkeeper. "We'll speak to them." We moved toward the back of the inn, where the mayor sat with a small group of villagers deep in conversation. The man was a stout fellow with a keel, full mustache, and a heavily embroidered coat that marked him as someone of some local prominence. He looked up as we approached, his brow furrowing at the sight of Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," the mayor said, his voice heavy with suspicion, "what brings you to Ashcombe? Another case of scandal, I presume? We've already had enough of that with poor Clara." Holmes nodded politely, his tone calm. "Day, we're investigating the tragic death of your village's resident. It seems there is more to it than a simple accident. And I'm afraid I need your help." The mayor's face tightened at the mention of Clara's death, his eyes darting nervously. "Help? I'm afraid I'm not in the business of solving murders, Mr. Holmes. Clara's death was a tragedy, yes, but I can't see how we could be of any help to you." Holmes didn't flinch. "It's not just the death I'm concerned with, Mr. Mayor. It's the circumstances surrounding it. We know that Clara had a secret. She wasn't just a quiet woman hiding away. Someone else, perhaps someone close to her, may have known too much. I need to understand who she was confiding in." The mayor hesitated, his face reddening with frustration. "I don't know what you mean. Clara kept her affairs to herself. If she had any secrets, she didn't share them with me." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he fixed the mayor with a penetrating gaze. "Is that so? Because I'm led to believe there were several people who were very close to her. Her cousin Evelyn, for one. And then, of course, there's the matter of your involvement with her family." The mayor stiffened, a flush creeping up his neck. "S'il vous plaît, monsieur, my involvement with Clara's family was entirely professional, Mr. Holmes. I had nothing to do with her death. If you want information, you should speak to her cousin Evelyn. She was the one who spent the most time with Clara." Holmes stood up, his gaze lingering on the mayor for a moment longer. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Mayor. I'll take your advice." We left the mayor and his table of companions, Holmes's mind already racing with the new information. The mayor's nervousness was telling, and I could tell Holmes was already piecing together the layers of the mystery. It was clear that the mayor knew more than he was letting on, but he wasn't going to be forthcoming just yet. Our next stop was Evelyn, Clara's cousin, who lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. She was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to hold a quiet intensity. When she saw us at the door, she looked at Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." She greeted us coldly. "What can I do for you?" Holmes wasted no time. Yes. We're investigating the circumstances surrounding Clara's death, Miss Evelyn. I understand you were close to her. Perhaps you can help us understand what happened." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've already spoken to the authorities. There's nothing more to say." And Holmes studied her closely, his eyes flicking to the objects around her. Framed photographs, a half-finished knitting project, and an old book on a nearby shelf. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, and I could tell that Evelyn was holding something back. "You were close to Clara, weren't you?" Holmes pressed gently. "You would have known if something was troubling her, if she had a secret, or if someone was threatening her." Evelyn's composure faltered for a moment. Her hands tightened around the edge of the chair she sat in, and her eyes briefly shifted to the side, as though she were trying to hide her emotions. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice a little sharper than before. "Clara was a private person. She kept her problems to herself. I had no idea there was anything wrong until it was too late." Holmes did not back down. "You're lying, Miss Evelyn. You know more than you're letting on. Clara had secrets, and you were part of them." The tension in the room was palpable now. Evelyn's face grew pale, her breath quickening as she glanced nervously toward the door, as if considering whether to flee. but something in her expression shifted, and she finally let out a resigned sigh. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling. Clara had been seeing someone she didn't want anyone to know about. I don't know who he was, but she said he was dangerous. She didn't want me to say anything, and I didn't. But she was terrified of him, and now she's dead. The revelation hung in the air, thick with implications. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he stepped closer, his mind already turning, connecting the dots. "Do you know where I can find this man? Can you tell me more about him?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where he is. Clara didn't give me his name, but I know he's the reason she was so frightened. She told me she had to get away from him." Holmes's gaze was sharp as ever. "Thank you, Miss Evelyn. You've been most helpful." We left the cottage. I turned to Holmes, my mind racing with the new information. A dangerous man, a secret relationship, and Clara's sudden fear. Everything was beginning to fit together, but we were still missing the most crucial part of the puzzle. Who was this man, and what did he have to do with Clara's death? Holmes looked at me, his eyes glinting with purpose. "The pieces are beginning to fall into place, Watson, but we're not done yet. We need to find out who Clara was truly afraid of, and why." We continued our journey through the village, knowing that the answers we sought were just within reach. Air had begun to fade as the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the village of Ashcombe. The quiet, picturesque town seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the inevitable unraveling of secrets that had long been hidden beneath its peaceful facade. As Holmes and I continued our investigation, we found ourselves at the edge of the village once more, this time making our way toward the residence of someone who had been mentioned in passing. Dr. Horace Carrington, a local physician. Dr. Carrington had been Clara Davis's family doctor for several years, and several villagers had hinted at his involvement in the tangled web surrounding her death. There were whispers, though, few dared to speak them aloud, that Clara's health had been in decline in recent months, that her visits to the doctor had grown more frequent. But what, exactly, had been the nature of her visits? And why had Clara chosen to confide in Dr. Carrington rather than her family or friends? As we approached the doctor's office, I noticed that it was a modest building, no more than a stone's throw from the village square. A sign bearing the doctor's name swung gently in the breeze. It was a typical rural practice, quiet, efficient, and perhaps just a little too ordinary to be of much interest to someone like Holmes, but I knew better than to underestimate the power of seemingly trivial details. Holmes knocked briskly on the door, and it was opened by a middle-aged woman who looked at us with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She was dressed plainly, a sharp contrast to the wealthier villagers we had met, and her face was lined with the fatigue of years spent in service. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "I'm Sherlock Holmes," Holmes replied smoothly, tipping his hat slightly. "This is Dr. Watson. We're investigating the death of Miss Clara Davis, and we'd like to speak with Dr. Carrington. We believe he may have some information that could assist us." The woman's expression shifted imperceptibly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Dr. Carrington is in his office," she said, her tone guarded, "but he's rather busy today. If you have any questions, perhaps I can help." Holmes's eyes gleamed, but he didn't press. "Thank you, but I'm afraid we must speak with the doctor directly. It's a matter of some urgency." With a hesitant nod, the woman stepped aside, ushering us into a dimly lit hallway. The atmosphere inside the house felt strangely oppressive, as though something hidden was lurking just beyond the walls. As we made our way toward the back of the house, I couldn't help but feel that this was yet another dead end, just another attempt at evasion by someone trying to protect their own interests. When we reached Dr. Carrington's office, the door was ajar, and I could hear the soft murmur of voices from within. Then Holmes pushed the door open slightly and stepped inside, with me close behind. The room was sparsely furnished, with a large oak desk at the center, covered in papers and medical charts. Dr. Carrington, a tall, lean man in his early 40s, was sitting behind the desk, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up at us with a faint frown, clearly taken aback by our sudden intrusion. "Mr. Holmes," Dr. Carrington said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Dr. Watson, what can I do for you today?" Holmes wasted no time, his eyes fixed on the doctor. "Dr. Carrington, we're investigating the death of Miss Clara Davis. We believe you may have relevant information regarding her health and the nature of her visits to you." Carrington's expression hardened slightly, and he sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss my patients, Mr. Holmes. Doctor-patient confidentiality, you understand." Holmes remained unmoved, his voice calm but insistent. "I understand completely, Dr. Carrington. However, Miss Davis's death was no ordinary accident. We've reason to believe that the circumstances surrounding her demise are far more complex than they appear. Any information you could provide would be invaluable." Carrington sighed, a deep weariness settling over him as he leaned forward. "Clara was a difficult case," he admitted, his voice low. "She had been experiencing anxiety for several months. She spoke of feeling watched, of being followed. I thought it was just stress, but she was convinced something was wrong. She asked me to prescribe her something to help with the stress, but I never would have imagined she was in any danger." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already working through the implications of this new information. "Did she mention anything specific? Who was she afraid of? Was there anyone she suspected?" Carrington hesitated for a moment before answering. "She never said outright, but there was something in her eyes, something urgent. It wasn't just paranoia. She seemed convinced someone was trying to harm her. But who exactly, I couldn't say. I didn't press her on it. I thought it was just a passing phase that she'd eventually calm down." "And did she ever mention any individuals in particular?" Holmes pressed, his voice growing more insistent. "Anyone who might have had a reason to hurt her?" Dr. Carrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There was a man," he said slowly, his tone reluctant. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but Clara mentioned him once. A tall man," she said, with a scar across his face. "She was terrified of him. She said he had been following her for weeks." Holmes's gaze snapped to Carrington. His interest piqued. "A man with a scar? Did Clara tell you anything else about him? His name? Where he lived?" Carrington shook his head. "No, just that he was always watching her. She said he would appear at odd times, at the market, near her home, even outside her window, late at night. But that's all she ever said. She refused to talk about him further." Holmes stood up, his mind racing, and Clara didn't mention any of this to the authorities. Carrington looked away, his jaw tightening. No, she was too scared. She didn't trust anyone, not even the police. I could see Holmes processing the new information, his mind already connecting dots that I couldn't yet see. There was clearly more to this story than met the eye. Clara's fear, her secretive behavior, and the man with the scar. Everything was pointing in a certain direction, but we were still missing the key piece. Holmes turned to the doctor, his voice sharp. "I think you know more than you're letting. On, Dr. Carrington. Who is this man with the scar? Why was Clara so frightened? What is he after?" Carrington's face hardened and he straightened in his chair. "I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I truly don't. I wish I could help you more, but I can't." Holmes studied him for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I think you can, Dr. Carrington, and I think you will, before this case is over." With that, Holmes turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. I followed closely behind, my mind buzzing with the new information. The man with the scar. Who was he? What did he want with Clara Davis? And what role did Dr. Carrington play in all of this? As we stepped out into the cold afternoon air, Holmes turned to me with that familiar glint in his eye. "We've made progress, Watson, but we've only just begun." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. The next day, the investigation into Clara Davis's death took a more complicated turn. Holmes and I had returned to Baker Street to review our findings so far, and, as was customary, Holmes had thrown himself into the case with the intensity of someone who could already see the full picture, even when only half of it had been uncovered. I, on the other hand, felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing against me, each one more perplexing than the last. The doctor's revelation about Clara's fear and the mysterious figure with the scar had added a new layer of complexity. There was clearly something lurking in the shadows, something that Clara had known, but which no one seemed willing to speak of in any clear terms. As we sat in the study, reviewing notes and letters, I could sense Holmes's mind turning, as though he were unlocking the secrets buried in the case with each passing moment. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "what are we missing? We have all these pieces, the doctor's account, the man with the scar, but there's something that doesn't fit. What are we overlooking?" Holmes looked up from the papers spread across the table. His eyes were sharp, his gaze unfocused, as if he were staring past the documents, seeing the full scope of the situation. "You're quite right, Watson," he said slowly. "We are missing something, but it's not just about the connections between the people involved, it's about the inconsistencies in the story. There is something off about the timing of Clara's death, something that doesn't align with the evidence at hand." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his sudden shift in focus. "Inconsistencies? What do you mean?" Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on the table. "Think about it. Clara was found dead near the lake, presumed to have drowned. But there are no signs of a struggle, no marks on the ice where she might have tried to climb out. And yet, despite her being found near the water, no one heard anything. No one heard her fall or call for help. It's too quiet, Watson, too controlled. And that is what I believe we are overlooking." I sat back, considering Holmes's words. The more I thought about it, the more it struck me that he was right. Clara's death was too clean, too silent. If she had fallen through the ice, there should have been a commotion, some indication of her distress. Yet everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated incident, something more than just an accidental drowning. Holmes stood up abruptly and began to pace the room. "There's more," he continued. "The man with the scar, the cousin Evelyn's vague statements, the doctor's reluctance. There's an undercurrent here that we've yet to address fully. I believe Clara was killed not by the ice, but by someone who manipulated the scene. Someone who knew the lake, who knew how to make it appear as though the death was an accident." I could feel a shift in the air as Holmes spoke. His deduction was beginning to take shape, his logic forming the outline of something far more sinister than I had anticipated. "Holmes," I asked, now completely captivated by his train of thought, "are you saying that Clara's death was staged?" "Precisely, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "The cry under the ice wasn't just a warning, it was a signal. Someone wanted to make sure that Clara's death was seen as an accident, that no one would suspect foul play, and that, I believe, is why the man with the scar is crucial to this investigation." Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes alight with the excitement of the chase. "The man with the scar didn't just follow Clara, Watson. He watched her, studied her. He knew how to orchestrate the scene perfectly, to make it look like an unfortunate accident, one that could be easily explained away." I absorbed his words, the implications settling over me like a weight. If Clara's death was indeed a staged event, it meant that the conspiracy was much larger than we had thought. The man with the scar was not just a figure of fear. He was a manipulator, someone with the skill to control the narrative, to hide the truth. "But how does the waltz fit into all of this?" I asked, suddenly realizing that our investigation had yet to fully address the role of Clara's connection to the music. "Is it just a symbol, or is there something more?" Holmes gave me a small, knowing smile. "Ah, Watson, you've finally arrived at the heart of the matter. Clara's connection to the waltz, to Ellington's composition, it's no coincidence. The waltz is the key to understanding this entire plot. But more importantly, it's a clue, hidden in plain sight." I felt a surge of realization. So Clara wasn't just a victim. She was involved in something bigger, a web of intrigue. She had to have known about it, and her death. It's the final piece in a much larger puzzle. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Exactly. Watson, the waltz was never just music. It was a message that someone wanted to keep buried. And Clara's death? It was the last move in a game that's been unfolding for far longer than we realized." I felt a chill run through me as I grasped the enormity of the situation. The conspirators we had been chasing were playing a long game, one that had begun long before Clara's death and would continue long after. The waltz was the symbol, the connection. But the murder? It was the culmination of a scheme that had been meticulously planned. Holmes turned toward the door, his expression hardening with resolve. "We must move quickly, Watson. The pieces are falling into place, but we have little time before the conspiracy tightens its grip further. There are more people involved than we've yet identified, and Miss Hartwell is still at the center of it all. We must confront her before she disappears again." I stood up, the urgency in Holmes's tone driving me to action. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to align. But I knew that this case would be far from straightforward. The waltz, the cry under the ice, the man with the scar. It was all part of a larger, more dangerous game, and Holmes was determined to expose it all. "We'll need to move carefully, Holmes," I said, my voice steady but filled with anticipation. "There are too many unknowns, too many people hiding behind their masks." Holmes gave a quick nod, his eyes gleaming with that familiar fire. "Indeed, Watson, but the truth is always the most dangerous thing in a conspiracy. And once we have it, we will be ready." With that, we left Baker Street and set our course for the next part of the investigation, one step closer to uncovering the truth. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. The following days in Ashcombe felt increasingly tense as Holmes and I delved deeper into the mystery of Clara Davis's death. Every new discovery seemed to peel back yet another layer of the intricate web that surrounded the case. And with each revelation, the truth became more elusive. Clara's death had been tragic, yes, but it was also a carefully orchestrated act, a deliberate murder hidden beneath the veil of an unfortunate accident. The villagers, though eager to help, were no longer speaking openly. Suddenly, it was as if some invisible force had closed their mouths, silencing their tongues with fear. Holmes had been right. There was more to this than a simple drowning. The more we learned, the more complicated the case seemed to become. The revelation about Harrow, the man with the scar, had been a crucial turning point. But even now, as we traced his steps through the village, there was a sense of incompleteness to our investigation. The pieces didn't quite fit. Harrow, a man with a history in London and a present in Ashcombe, was clearly at the heart of this conspiracy. But was he the only one involved, or was there someone else pulling the strings from behind the scenes? Holmes had a theory, I knew that much, but as always, he kept it to himself for now, preferring to work through the details in the silence of his mind. And I, as always, followed his lead, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would come together in one swift, brilliant deduction. It wasn't long before we returned to the lake where Clara's body had been discovered. The weather had changed dramatically. The winds had grown colder, and a new layer of frost had begun to settle on the ground. The ice, which had once been an open stage for Clara's tragic death, now appeared even more ominous. An unbroken sheet of frozen water, as though it were hiding something beneath its smooth surface. Holmes stood at the edge of the lake, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the expanse of ice. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "Holmes, you've been quiet," I remarked, unable to keep the curiosity from my voice. "What's on your mind?" Holmes glanced over at me, his sharp eyes flickering with the light of a new thought. "It's a matter of timing, Watson. Clara's body was found near this very spot. But there's something wrong about the positioning. You see, the area where she was found is far too specific, too staged. It doesn't make sense. The killer knew exactly where to leave her body. They knew where the ice would be weakest. But why there? I asked. Why the lake? Why the ice? Holmes turned his full attention to me, his gaze sharp. The ice is symbolic, Watson. It is both a barrier and a weapon. The killer chose this particular spot to make sure Clara's death would be seen as an accident. They needed the location to appear random, but they also needed it to carry a specific message, something that would suggest an accidental fall. I nodded, though I still wasn't entirely sure what Holmes was getting at. But why the cry under the ice, then? Why the strange noises that everyone heard? Surely that would contradict the idea of it being an accident. Holmes's lips quirked into a small smile. Precisely. That's the inconsistency I've been trying to pin down. The cry, the sound that everyone heard, was a deliberate addition to the scene. It was meant to draw attention, but not to Clara. It was meant to distract, to make people believe something was happening beneath the surface that wasn't truly there. I furrowed my brow. You'd think someone was trying to send a message. But to whom? Holmes's expression became serious once more. That is what we need to figure out, Watson. The cry wasn't meant for Clara. It was meant for someone else. Someone who could have been watching, waiting, and who could have seen through the deception. As Holmes spoke, the atmosphere around us grew even more oppressive. The icy wind whipped through the trees, and the fog that had begun to roll in felt like it was thickening with each passing minute. The entire scene felt wrong, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to give. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us staring out at the frozen lake. Holmes was clearly lost in thought, but I could sense his frustration. He was so close to the answer I could feel it, but the pieces weren't quite falling into place. "Holmes," I ventured cautiously, "what if Harrow didn't act alone? What if there's someone else involved? Someone we haven't considered?" Holmes turned to face me, his eyes narrowing. "That's precisely what I've been thinking, Watson. Harrow may be the man behind the intimidation and the threats, but there's someone else who has orchestrated all of this, someone who stands to gain from Clara's death." I felt a chill run through me. The case had gone from puzzling to sinister. If we were right, we were dealing with a far-reaching conspiracy, one that involved not only there's also a much larger plot, something that could still be unfolding as we stood there, on the edge of that frozen lake. "Need to speak to more people," Holmes continued, his voice decisive. "There's a connection between Clara's death, the mysterious cry, and the waltz that no one is willing to talk about. Someone knows more than they've let on." With that, Holmes began walking back toward the village, his pace quick and purposeful. I followed closely behind, my mind whirling with the new pieces of the puzzle. The man with the scar, Harrow, was just one part of the equation. But the bigger question remained. Who had the most to gain from Clara's death? Who had the power to manipulate events from behind the scenes? As we reached the village, Holmes stopped and turned to me, his face suddenly illuminated by the first light of the setting sun. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe the answer lies in the connections Clara kept hidden from everyone else. And we have one more person to speak with. The person who might know everything." I nodded, feeling the weight of Holmes's words settle over me like a thick cloak. The investigation had reached a turning point, and we were now closer than ever to uncovering the truth. "Who is this person, Holmes?" I asked, already knowing that whatever followed would be the final key to unlocking the mystery. Holmes gave a sharp nod and smiled faintly, the glint of excitement in his eyes. "Miss Evelyn, Clara's cousin. She knows more than she's told us, and she's hiding something important." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next morning, we made our way to the modest cottage where Evelyn Davis lived. Her house, situated at the edge of the village, was a simple but well-kept structure, tucked away from the main road. The snow had begun to settle over Ashcombe, casting a quiet stillness across the town. Holmes walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert, always calculating. "Holmes," I began, my breath misting in the cold air, "what do you suspect Evelyn knows? What has she been hiding all this time?" Holmes paused for a moment, glancing at me before answering. "Evelyn Davis has been the key to unraveling this entire case, Watson. She has the connections, ties to both Clara and the people involved in her death. She was too close to the situation to remain completely unaware. But her reluctance to speak, her evasions, those are the signs of someone hiding something crucial." I nodded, absorbing his words. Evelyn had always struck me as someone who knew more than she let on, but I hadn't yet figured out the extent of her involvement. It was clear, though, that Clara's cousin wasn't simply a bystander in this case. She was a piece of the puzzle that we still hadn't fully unlocked. When we reached Evelyn's cottage, we found her inside, sitting by a crackling fire. She rose to greet us, her expression guarded, but not unfriendly. Her dark eyes held a mixture of wariness and resignation, as if she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of exhaustion. "I didn't expect you so soon." "We appreciate you seeing us, Miss Evelyn," Holmes replied, his tone respectful but probing. "We've come to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind." Evelyn gestured for us to sit, and we did, settling ourselves across from her. There was a quiet tension in the room, the air thick with unspoken words. Evelyn looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a small piece of cloth, and for a moment the silence hung heavily between us. Holmes didn't waste time. "Miss Evelyn, you told us that Clara had been frightened, that she mentioned a man following her, a man with a scar. What did she tell you about him? You've been avoiding giving us a direct answer." Evelyn's face paled slightly, her fingers tightening around the cloth. "I've told you everything I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara was afraid, but she wouldn't speak much of it. She never said his name, just that he was dangerous. I never believed her at first. She had a tendency to overreact, but in the last few months, she was different. She seemed more frightened, more on edge. She insisted she was being watched. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her with that calculating intensity. "Miss Evelyn, I believe you know more than you're telling us. You were close to Clara, and yet you're withholding something important. Why?" Evelyn looked up sharply, her face flushing with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I don't know what you want me to say. I never wanted to get involved in Clara's fears. She was always so secretive. She had a way of pulling people in, making them believe things that weren't true." "Did she ever mention anyone else?" Holmes pressed, his voice steady but insistent. "Anyone who might have had a reason to harm her? Did she tell you about Harrow?" Evelyn's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Harrow's name. "Harrow?" she echoed, almost in disbelief. "How do you know that name?" Holmes's gaze didn't falter. "Clara mentioned him in a letter." She was terrified. "Of him? You know more than you're letting on. Tell me, Miss Evelyn, who was Harrow to Clara? What was his connection to her?" Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face flushed with emotion. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging in resignation. "Clara and Harrow were involved in the past," Evelyn admitted, her voice thick with hesitation. "They were once very close, but their relationship ended badly. Harrow was a man of ambition, ruthless in his pursuit of what he wanted. Clara? She was vulnerable back then. Harrow took advantage of her, used her to further his own ends. I felt the air shift in the room as the truth began to surface. Clara's connection to Harrow, which had previously been nothing more than a whispered name, now took on a more sinister meaning. This wasn't just a story of a frightened woman. It was a tale of manipulation, of someone who had been caught in the web of a man whose only interest was power. Holmes's eyes never left Evelyn's face. What happened between them? Why did Clara leave him? Evelyn glanced down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Clara left him because she realized how dangerous he was. She saw through his facade, his charm, his manipulation. She wanted to break free from him, but it wasn't that simple. Harrow didn't let her go so easily. He didn't take rejection well, especially from someone who knew his secrets. "Secrets?" Holmes repeated, his voice quiet but insistent. Evelyn hesitated before nodding. Yes, Harrow had his hands in many things. Things that were illegal, dangerous. He wasn't just a man with power. He had connections. Clara didn't want to be part of that anymore. That's why she came to Ashcombe, to escape him. But even here, she couldn't shake him off. Holmes leaned back, his expression contemplative. So Harrow followed her to Ashcombe. But why wait so long to act? What triggered him now? Evelyn bit her lip, as though grappling with her next words. I don't know for sure, but Clara had something. Something Harrow wanted. She never told me what it was, but she was afraid. She thought he'd come for it. She thought he would never stop until he had it. Holmes nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing with the possibilities. Clara had something valuable, something Harrow sought to possess. And her death. It was part of his plan to regain control. I looked at Holmes, realizing the scale of what we were dealing with. Harrow wasn't just an ex-lover. He was a man involved in a web of power and deceit. And Clara's attempts to break free had only served to make her a target. Holmes stood abruptly, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something unseen. "Thank you, Miss Evelyn. You've provided valuable information, though I suspect there's much more you're not telling us. But you've helped us narrow the focus. Harrow is the key to this entire case, and we must find him before he strikes again." Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes downcast. "I never wanted any of this, Mr. Holmes. I only wanted to protect Clara." Holmes gave her a brief, sympathetic glance. "We will find him, Miss Evelyn, but you must understand, this isn't over yet. We are all connected in this, and together we must uncover the truth before it's too late." With that, Holmes and I left Evelyn's cottage, the weight of her confession lingering in the air. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Harrow's presence in Ashcombe, Clara's fear, and the mysterious secrets she had hidden were all leading us toward a confrontation. We were closing in, but the danger was far from over. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the determination that had always defined him. "The next step, Watson, is to find Harrow. But we need to move quickly. There's no time to waste." We walked through the village, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the snow. The fog that had settled over Ashcombe seemed to lift slightly, but in its place there was something darker, more menacing. The case was far from finished, and I knew that the answers we sought lay just ahead, hidden in the shadows. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The morning after our conversation with Evelyn, the case had taken a sharp turn toward urgency. The pieces we had gathered so far were beginning to form a clearer picture, but they were still disjointed. Fragments of a story that had been deliberately obscured. Harrow, the man with the scar, was at the heart of it all, but the full extent of his involvement remained elusive. And now, as Holmes and I prepared to track him down, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every step we took seemed to bring us closer to something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. Holmes, however, was as calm as ever. His focus was unwavering, and his mind worked like a well-oiled machine, sifting through the facts with a precision I could only marvel at. We had one goal: find Harrow before he could act again. The letter from Clara had been a key piece of the puzzle, revealing the threat that had haunted her for months. But now, we needed to understand why Harrow had waited until now to strike. Seydoux village of Ashcombe had grown quieter in the days following Clara's death. The cold had driven most people indoors, and the streets seemed to hang heavy with the secrets that had been buried under layers of snow and time. But as Holmes and I made our way to the town square that morning, I felt a shift in the air, a sense of impending danger that seemed to tighten around us, Holmes. I asked quietly as we walked, "How do we know Harrow won't strike again before we find him?" Holmes gave a brief, knowing glance in my direction. "Because, Watson, I believe we're closer to him than we think. He's been hiding in plain sight, operating from the shadows, but he's left us clues, and the time for subtlety is over. He's made his move." I nodded, but my mind was still racing with the enormity of what we were facing. Harrow wasn't just a criminal. He was a man of influence, someone with ties to dangerous people, and the power to manipulate events from behind the scenes. If he had indeed been behind Clara's death, then he wasn't just trying to cover his tracks, he was playing a far more dangerous game. It was then that we received word from one of the villagers, a frantic message delivered by a messenger on horseback. Holmes read it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the news. The letter was brief, but its implications were clear. Another incident had occurred, this time not far from the estate where Clara had lived. A second attempt, Holmes muttered almost to himself. I was afraid of this. The message informed us that a man, described as tall with a scar on his face, had been seen near the lake. He had been acting suspiciously, watching the villagers from the shadows, but had disappeared before anyone could approach him. His presence was alarming, but it was what he had done afterward that made the situation even more dire. The cry, the same cry that had been heard the night of Clara's death, had been heard again, this time not from the ice, but from the nearby woods. Holmes, do you think he's trying to cover his tracks again? I asked, already anticipating his answer. Holmes gave a quick nod. Yes, Watson, this is Harrow's way of distracting us. He wants us to believe we're chasing shadows, that there's something else at play here. But he's making a mistake. He's underestimating us. We hurried toward the village outskirts, moving swiftly through the narrow, snow-lined streets. Holmes's mind was already working through the possible scenarios, but as we neared the woods where the cry had been heard, the tension in the air became palpable. The snow had begun to fall again, thick and heavy, as if nature itself were attempting to obscure the truth. We reached the edge of the woods and paused. The trees loomed ahead, their bare branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, and the silence was overwhelming. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more isolated we felt, like we were walking into the heart of a trap. Holmes? I whispered. Do you think we're close? Holmes's eyes scanned the area, his gaze sharp and calculating. We are very close, Watson. Harrow will make his move soon. We just have to be ready. We pressed forward, our footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of snow. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the anticipation growing with each step. Holmes, however, was the picture of calm, moving with deliberate precision, as though he were already several steps ahead of me in his thinking. Suddenly, a noise ahead had caught our attention. It was faint at first, just the rustling of leaves and the faintest crunch of snow, but as we moved closer, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. We were getting closer. I motioned to Holmes, and we crouched low, moving carefully through the underbrush. The sounds came again, closer now, faint whispers, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the snow. And then, in the distance, we saw him. The figure of a man emerged from the shadows of the trees, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the hood of a dark coat. As he moved closer, the scar on his face became visible, the jagged mark a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface. It was Harrow. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he gestured for me to stay quiet. The figure was just ahead, walking with a slow, deliberate pace, as though he knew he was being followed. He paused for a moment, his head turning slightly, as though sensing something was wrong. And then, as if to confirm his suspicion, he started to move faster, vanishing into the trees. After him, Holmes hissed, his voice low but urgent. We gave chase, our feet crunching in the snow as we pushed through the undergrowth. Harrow was fast, moving with purpose. But Holmes was just as swift, his long legs carrying him easily through the forest. We were closing in on him, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and charged with the promise of confrontation. As we rounded a bend in the path, we found ourselves in a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a dark, frozen pond. Harrow was standing at the far side, his back to us, as though he had been waiting for us to catch up. Holmes stopped abruptly, his voice low, but filled with authority. "Harrow, it's over. We have you now." The man turned slowly, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Do you really think you've caught me, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice like gravel. "You've underestimated me." "All of you have." Holmes didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are, Harrow, and I know why you killed Clara. You thought she was a threat to your plans, but now the game's over." Harrow's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think so, Holmes? You think you can stop me? You're too late." Before either of us could react, Harrow moved swiftly, darting to the side. In a flash, he disappeared behind a cluster of trees, vanishing once more into the shadows of the forest. Holmes cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the area. "He's gone, Watson, but we're closer than we've ever been. He knows we're onto him now, and that means he'll make his final move soon." I felt a knot form in my stomach. We had come so close, too close to let him slip away again. But Holmes was right. We were nearing the end of the line, and Harrow's desperation would lead him to make one last fatal mistake. Pursuit of Harrow had become an exhausting game of cat and mouse, and despite our best efforts, he always seemed one step ahead. The deep woods around Ashcombe had become a labyrinth of shadows, each corner hiding another twist in the puzzle that we were so determined to solve. Holmes was tireless, his mind constantly churning with new deductions and theories, but I could sense his growing frustration. Harrow had led us on a wild chase, always just out of reach, and the weight of the unanswered questions began to press down on both of us. As we returned to the village, after losing track of Harrow once again, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath, anticipating some final act in this deadly drama. Holmes, however, remained focused, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every person we passed, looking for any sign of the elusive. "Man, I don't understand," I said, my voice strained with the weight of our inability to corner Harrow. "He must know we're after him. Why hasn't he tried to flee? Why does he continue to toy with us?" Holmes gave a soft chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "That's just it, Watson. Harrow doesn't think we can catch him. He's confident, too confident. He believes that he's already won." I glanced at Holmes, realizing the deeper meaning behind his words. "You think he's been letting us follow him on purpose?" "Exactly," Holmes said, his voice calm, but filled with the kind of certainty that only he could maintain. "Harrow is playing a game, and he's been one step ahead of us all along. But now he's starting to underestimate us." We stopped at the village square, and Holmes turned to face me, his expression serious. "The key to this case, Watson, lies in Clara Davis's death, but it also lies in what she was hiding. She wasn't just an innocent victim caught in the crossfire. She was part of something larger, something much more dangerous." I frowned, trying to make sense of Holmes's cryptic statement. But Clara didn't want to be involved. She was trying to escape Harrow, trying to break free from the life he had entrapped her in. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, but what we have to remember is that Clara wasn't just trying to escape Harrow. She was trying to protect something, something that Harrow wanted badly enough to kill for. The realization hit me like a cold wind. You think she was hiding something? Something that could have brought Harrow's plans crashing down? Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. Precisely, Watson. Clara had something that Harrow wanted, something so valuable that he was willing to go to any lengths to take it from her. And when she realized the extent of his ruthlessness, she tried to disappear. But Harrow didn't let her. He never intended to let her go. I felt a shiver run through me. It was becoming clearer now. Clara's death wasn't just a murder. It was a calculated move, part of a larger plan that had been unfolding for far longer than we had realized. Holmes's voice lowered, the weight of his words sinking in. Harrow wasn't just chasing Clara. He was chasing the secret she carried. The question is, what was that secret? And why was it so important to him? I thought back to the cryptic words Clara had written in her letter about Harrow's past and the things he had done. It was as if her entire life had been one long game of escape. But now I was beginning to see that she hadn't just been running from Harrow. She had been running from something far more dangerous than I had imagined. "Holmes," I said, my voice tinged with urgency. "We need to find what Clara was protecting. We need to know what it is that Harrow was willing to kill for." Holmes nodded gravely. "And we will, Watson. But first, we need to confront Evelyn again. She's the last piece of the puzzle we need. She knows more than she's told us. And it's time we pressed her for the truth." The thought of returning to Evelyn's cottage filled me with a sense of unease. We had already spoken with her, but there was still something about her. Something in the way she had acted that made me believe she was hiding more than she had let on. If she knew anything about Clara's secret, it was time for her to speak up. Holmes and I made our way back to the cottage, the cold wind biting at our faces as we walked. When we arrived, Evelyn was sitting by the fire again, her face pale and her eyes downcast. The moment she saw us, she stiffened, as though bracing herself for another round of questioning. Holmes wasted no time. "Miss Evelyn," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "we need to know everything you know about Clara's connection to Harrow. What was she hiding? And why did she believe it was so important?" Evelyn looked up at us, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. She had been avoiding eye contact, her hands wringing in her lap as if she were struggling to find the right words. "I've already told you everything I can," she said, her voice tight. "Clara was afraid, yes, but I don't know what she was hiding. She didn't confide in me, not fully. She was too scared to trust anyone." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Evelyn, you knew Clara better than anyone. She trusted you. You must know what she was protecting, what she was running from." Evelyn's face tightened, her lips trembling. After a long moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara had something Harrow wanted, but she never told me exactly what it was. She said it was too dangerous, too powerful. I think it was something connected to his past, something he couldn't afford to lose." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what was that? Something, Miss Evelyn? What was it that Clara knew?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I never got the chance to ask." But whatever it was, Clara was terrified. She said it could destroy him if it was ever made public. She said she had to protect it. Holmes straightened, his mind clearly racing. "Then it's not just Harrow we need to worry about. There are others involved in this, people who want whatever Clara was protecting. Evelyn nodded, her expression filled with dread. I think Clara was more involved in Harrow's world than any of us realized. She didn't just escape him. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. Then it's time we found out exactly what Clara was hiding. And we will, Miss Evelyn. We sure will. As we left Evelyn's cottage, I felt the weight of the case settle over me. The final pieces were starting to fall into place. Harrow was not acting alone. There were others, people with their own agendas, and they were all circling around Clara's secret. "We'll need to move quickly, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low with determination. "This case is far from over, and if we don't act soon, Harrow's final move will be his last." The fog that had settled over Ashcombe seemed to grow denser with each passing hour, like the village itself was shrouding the truth from our eyes. Holmes and I had spent the last several days chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of a much larger puzzle. The pieces, Clara's mysterious death, the elusive Harrow, Evelyn's reluctant confessions, were all part of a web that stretched far beyond our initial understanding. But even as we neared the end of our investigation, it felt as though we were still missing something crucial. Holmes had not shared his full theory with me yet, but I could tell by the intensity of his focus that he was close to a breakthrough. We had spoken little in the last few hours, and I knew that he was preparing for the final move. What that move would be, I couldn't say, but I trusted him implicitly. Holmes rarely allowed himself to be outwitted, and when he set his mind to a case, he was relentless in his pursuit of the truth. The events of the past few days had confirmed one thing. Harrow, the man with the scar, was no ordinary criminal. His actions weren't motivated by simple malice or greed. No, Harrow was after something far more elusive, something powerful enough to drive him to murder and manipulate those around him. He had come to Ashcombe for a reason, and that reason had everything to do with Clara's death. As we sat in the dimly lit study at Baker Street, Holmes placed his hands together. His fingers steepled in that familiar gesture I had come to associate with his most brilliant deductions. He had been quiet for some time, lost in thought. Finally, he broke the silence. "Watson," he said, his voice calm, but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. "The time has come for us to confront Harrow. We have gathered enough information, and now it is time for him to reveal his hand." I raised an eyebrow. "You think we've caught him, Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of confidence. "Not yet, Watson, but we will. We've been playing his game, following his every move. Now it's time to turn the tables." I leaned forward, intrigued by his words. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze never left mine. "I've devised a plan, Watson. We are going to bait Harrow into making his next move, and we'll catch him in the act." The idea of luring a dangerous man like Harrow into a trap wasn't one I particularly relished, but I knew better than to question Holmes when his mind was set. He had led us through more perilous situations than I could count, and he always had a plan, no matter how convoluted it seemed at the time. "You want to use Clara's death as bait?" I asked, my voice uncertain. Holmes nodded slowly. "Not just Clara's death, Watson. We need to use everything we know. The waltz, the letters, the cryptic messages Clara left behind. We'll create a scenario that Harrow can't resist. He'll believe we've discovered what he's been hiding, and he'll come to us." I felt a pang of unease. And what if he decides not to come? What if he knows we're setting him up? Holmes's lips twitched in amusement. That's precisely why we must be careful. Harrow is a man who thrives on manipulation. He thinks he's the one pulling the strings, but we'll let him believe that. We'll make him think he's controlling the game, and that will be his downfall. I nodded, beginning to understand the brilliance of Holmes's plan. By presenting Harrow with a carefully crafted set of circumstances, we would force him to reveal himself. It was risky, but it was also the only way to ensure that he didn't slip through our fingers again. Holmes stood up abruptly, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though he were already seeing the entire plan unfold. We need to make sure Harrow believes that Clara's secret is no longer hidden. We'll use Evelyn as a pawn. She knows enough about Clara's fears and her connection to Harrow to make it believable. We'll stage an encounter, a confrontation that will lure him out. The idea of involving Evelyn once more didn't sit well with me. She had already been through so much, and I couldn't help but feel that we were putting her in greater danger. But I trusted Holmes's judgment, and I knew that the plan was necessary. There was no other choice. "I'll arrange for Evelyn to meet us tonight in the town square," Holmes continued. "She will pretend to be the one who's discovered the truth about Clara's secret. She'll show Harrow that she knows about the waltz and that she's ready to expose everything, and when he takes the bait, we'll be ready." I hesitated, but how will we know he'll come? Holmes's smile grew wider, his eyes flashing with excitement. "Because he's been waiting for this moment, Watson. He's been hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting for the right time to strike. He's been confident, arrogant even, but he's starting to grow desperate. When he believes the secret is slipping from his grasp, he'll come for it." The more Holmes spoke, the more the plan seemed to make sense. Harrow's pride and desperation would be his undoing. He had already shown himself to be a man driven by fear and greed, and now we were going to use that against him. "We'll need to be quick," I said, my mind working through the logistics. "Once he's on the move, we'll have to act fast." Holmes nodded, his expression serious. "We will, Watson. But remember, the moment we set this trap in motion, there will be no turning back. Harrow is dangerous, and he'll stop at nothing to protect his secrets." I felt a chill run through me. Holmes was right. Harrow was a man who would do anything to keep his past, and the dangerous secrets it held, hidden. But now, for the first time, we were going to force him into the open. "I'll get in touch with Evelyn," I said, standing up, "and we'll prepare for the trap." Holmes gave a brief nod, his mind already a step ahead. "Very well, Watson. Once we've set the stage, we'll be ready. Harrow will make his move, and we will be waiting." As I left Baker Street to arrange the meeting with Evelyn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of something momentous. The trap had been set, and now we would see if Harrow's arrogance would lead to his downfall. But even as I prepared for what was to come, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. In this game of cat and mouse, the stakes were higher than ever, and one wrong move could tip the balance in Harrow's favor. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The night was cold, the fog still thick in the streets of Ashcombe, as Holmes and I prepared for the final step of our plan. The town square, usually bustling with the everyday hum of the village, was eerily quiet as we arrived. The lanterns cast long shadows on the cobblestone streets, and a sense of stillness hung in the air. It was the perfect setting for the trap we had set, and I could feel the tension coiling around us, as if the very night itself held its breath. Holmes walked ahead with his usual confidence, his dark coat trailing behind him like the shadow of the detective he had become. I followed closely, my mind racing with the implications of our plan. We were about to confront Harrow, and there was no going back. Holmes's trap was set, but the danger was far from over. Harrow, the man we had chased for so long, was not only a criminal, he was a man whose desperation could turn deadly at any moment. "Holmes," I said quietly as we walked, "are you certain about this? About Evelyn?" Holmes glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. "There is no other choice, Watson. Evelyn is the key. She is the one who has been the closest to Clara's secret, and she is the one who can bring Harrow into the open. Once he sees that he's about to lose what he values most, he'll make his move." I nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily upon me. Holmes had orchestrated everything down to the finest detail. Evelyn's involvement, the staged confrontation, and the timing. But even with all the pieces falling into place, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in my chest. Harrow was dangerous, and the stakes had never been higher. As we approached the square, I noticed Evelyn standing near the fountain, her silhouette barely visible in the mist. She was positioned just as we had planned, her posture tense, and her hands clasped in front of her. Holmes had insisted that we meet her alone, without any other witnesses, to avoid tipping Harrow off. It had been a risky decision, but it was the only way to ensure that Harrow wouldn't suspect a trap. Holmes stopped a few paces from her, his presence commanding and silent. I remained a step behind, watching closely. Evelyn turned at the sound of our footsteps, her face pale and strained, her eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. "You're here," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the task at hand. I don't know if I can do this, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze soft but determined. "You don't have to, Evelyn. You've already helped us more than you realize. But now we need you to play your part. When Harrow sees that you know the truth, he will act. He'll reveal himself, and we'll have him." She nodded, though her expression remained anxious. "I understand. I just hope I'm doing the right thing." "You are," Holmes assured her. "We've been one step behind Harrow for too long. But tonight, he will make the mistake of thinking he's the in control." We stood in the square for what seemed like an eternity, the quiet broken only by the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Every moment that passed, I could feel the tension growing thicker, like the calm before a storm. Holmes, ever the patient strategist, waited. He knew Harrow would come soon. The bait was set, and it was only a matter of time before he took the plunge. Minutes passed, and I began to wonder if Harrow had somehow figured out our plan, if he had seen through the ruse. But Holmes's confidence never wavered. He remained still, his eyes scanning the area, never missing a detail. And then, there it was, the faintest sound of footsteps approaching from the shadows. I stiffened, my pulse quickening. I looked to Holmes, and he nodded, signaling that this was it. Harrow had arrived. From the darkness emerged a tall figure, his silhouette barely visible against the mist. As he stepped closer, I could make out the unmistakable scar that marred his face, a jagged line that twisted across his cheek like a cruel reminder of his past. It was him, Harrow. He paused a few feet away from Evelyn, his eyes locking onto her with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, he said nothing, merely watching her with cold calculation, as if waiting for her to make the first move. Evelyn stood her ground, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had played her part, but the reality of the situation was settling in. Harrow was not a man to be underestimated. "Well," he said finally, his voice low and grating. "So you've figured it out, have you?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "I know what you did, Harrow. I know about Clara. I know what you were after." Harrow's lips curled into a sinister smile, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to her. "You don't know anything, Evelyn. You never did. Clara thought she could escape me, but she was wrong. She was always wrong." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the exchange, his mind working behind the scenes. I knew he was waiting for the precise moment to strike, but, for now, he remained silent, allowing Harrow to believe he was in control. Harrow's voice grew colder, more menacing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Evelyn. You think you can expose me, that you can take away what's mine? You don't understand the power I wield, and you don't understand who I am." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, but she stood firm. Her eyes locked on Harrow's. "I understand enough, Harrow. Clara was right about you. She was right to be afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore." At that moment, Harrow's smile faltered, his expression darkening. He took a step toward Evelyn, his movements quick and deliberate. But before he could make another move, Holmes sprang into action. "Now, Watson," Holmes commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. In an instant, Holmes and I moved into position, flanking Harrow from either side. The surprise on his face was fleeting, quickly replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. He had been caught in the act, and he knew it. "You've underestimated us, Harrow," Holmes said coolly, his voice steady and firm. "You've been playing a game you thought you controlled, but now the tables have turned." Harrow's eyes darted from Holmes to me, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. But before he could draw it, I had already disarmed him, the weapon falling to the ground with a loud clink. "Don't bother," Holmes said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "It's over." For a moment, Harrow stood there, his chest heaving with rage and disbelief. He looked as though he might lash out, but the realization that he had been caught, trapped in his own web of lies, began to sink in. The game was over. "I should have known," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and bitter. "You were always one step ahead of me, Holmes. But you'll never understand. I was never trying to escape. I was trying to win." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Winning doesn't mean what you think it does, Harrow. It's not about control or power. It's about truth. And now the truth will come out." As Harrow was led away, I could feel the weight of the case lifting from my shoulders. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and with it, the mystery had been solved. But, as I looked at Holmes, I knew that this case had been more than just a triumph for him. It had been a reminder that even in the most tangled of webs, the truth would always find a way to break free. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The arrest of Harrow, though significant, was far from the conclusion of the investigation. I had seen it countless times before. When a criminal believes they have been cornered, they often make one last desperate attempt to regain control, to escape the inevitable. Harrow was no exception. Even as we secured him in the village constable's office, I could sense the tension in the air, the almost palpable belief that he wasn't going to let this end so easily. Holmes, of course, had already anticipated that Harrow would try something. His keen instincts and sharp deductions had prepared him for this very eventuality. But as we sat in the constable's office, waiting for the authorities to process Harrow, a strange quiet had settled over the village. The moment we had been waiting for had arrived, yet something felt off, almost too calm, too controlled. I glanced over at Holmes, who was sitting by the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. His gaze was distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Despite the victory we had secured, I knew that Holmes was never content with half measures. He had seen something, perhaps in the look Harrow had given him as we led him into the cell, that hinted at an unfinished chapter in this story. "Holmes," I said softly, leaning forward, "what's bothering you? You seem preoccupied." Holmes didn't immediately respond. His gaze remained fixed on the fog-shrouded village square. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost eerily so. "I don't believe Harrow is the only one behind this," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think someone else is involved, someone we haven't accounted for." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. But Harrow is in custody. He was the one orchestrating the manipulation, the threats. He's the one we've been chasing. Holmes turned toward me, his expression unwavering. "Yes, Watson, but Harrow didn't act alone. I suspect someone has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, someone who's been watching us from the shadows, just as they watched." "Clara." I felt a surge of frustration. Who could it be? We've already interrogated everyone we could think of. Evelyn, Dr. Carrington, the villagers. We've traced Harrow's every movement. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "Precisely. We've done everything by the book, Watson, but we've overlooked one crucial detail. The person who benefits most from Clara's death is still unaccounted for. Harrow might have been the catalyst, but the true mastermind is someone we haven't considered." I sat back, trying to piece the puzzle together in my mind. The weight of Holmes's words was beginning to sink in. Clara's death had not been just a personal tragedy. It had been part of something larger. A conspiracy that had been playing out right under our noses. Harrow was merely the tip of the iceberg. "Who do you think it is?" I asked, my voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the window, his mind clearly racing ahead. "I have my suspicions, Watson, but we'll need to confront them directly to be sure." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by the sharp knock of the constable at the door. I tensed instinctively, sensing that something was about to shift. The constable stepped in, his face grave. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there's been a yeesh incident." Holmes stood up immediately, his expression hardening. "What sort of incident?" The constable swallowed, his voice low. "Harrow, he's escaped." A rush of shock and disbelief swept over me. Escaped? How is that possible? The aid cell was locked. We were just with him. The constable's face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. "I don't know, sir. He was in his cell under watch. But when we checked on him a short while ago, he was gone. The lock wasn't forced. It was as if he had vanished." Holmes's face was unreadable as he walked over to the constable, his movements deliberate. "This is no simple escape," he said quietly. "Harrow didn't just slip away unnoticed. Someone helped him." I felt a chill run through me as Holmes's words hit home. Harrow wasn't just a man on the run. He had orchestrated this escape, and someone in the village was complicit in his flight. "Have you notified the authorities?" I asked, trying to focus my thoughts. The constable nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. A search is underway, but we'll need your help. We've already questioned the staff and the locals, but no one saw anything unusual." Holmes turned toward me, his expression grim. "We need to find Harrow quickly. He's dangerous, And now that he's been freed, he's likely to strike again. He has nothing to lose. I followed Holmes as he moved toward the door, his mind already working through the possible scenarios. Holmes, where do we start? The village is small. If someone helped Harrow escape, they must have been in the vicinity. Someone must know something. Holmes paused at the door, his gaze sharpening as he turned to face me. We'll start where we left off, Watson. Harrow didn't act alone, and the person behind this conspiracy is still out there. We need to find out who has been helping him and why. The tension between us was palpable as we stepped into the cold night air. The sound of the village bells tolling in the distance. The search for Harrow had just begun, but it was clear that this was no longer just about him. There were deeper forces at work, and we were getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy. The fog had thickened again, and the night seemed to hold its breath. We moved through the village streets, the weight of the mystery pressing down in us. With each passing moment, I could feel the stakes rising. Harrow's escape was only the beginning. Whoever was helping him, whoever had been working behind the scenes, was still out there, waiting to make their next move. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. We must move quickly, Watson. Harrow will make his final attempt to cover his tracks, but this time we'll be ready. I nodded, my resolve hardening. The final confrontation was drawing near, and I knew that we were closer than ever to unraveling the truth. But with Harrow on the loose, the danger had escalated. The clock was ticking, and we needed to catch him before he disappeared into the shadows once again. The days that followed Harrow's escape were a blur of confusion and mounting tension. Holmes and I spent every waking moment searching for him, following every lead and questioning every villager. The once peaceful town of Ashcombe now felt suffocating, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Harrow's disappearance had turned the entire investigation on its head. What had once seemed like a murder case was now part of a much larger conspiracy. And with Harrow on the run, we were no longer just chasing him. We were chasing shadows. Holmes's demeanor had grown even more intense, his focus singular, as though he could already see the pieces of the puzzle coming together in his mind. I, on the other hand, felt the weight of the case pressing down on me. The fear that we were too late, that we might never find Harrow before his plan, came to fruition. The search had led us nowhere for days. Every possible lead we followed turned into another dead end. Harrow was good at covering his tracks, and the deeper we delved, the more it seemed as though we were getting further from the truth. Holmes, however, had a patience and perseverance that I couldn't help but admire. He refused to give up, to let the case slip away. It was on the evening of the fourth day after Harrow's escape that I saw the first true glimmer of hope. Chin were sitting in Holmes's study at Baker Street, reviewing our notes for the 100th time, when Holmes suddenly looked up from the papers strewn across the table. His eyes were sharp, a spark of recognition flaring in them. "Watson," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I believe I have finally cracked it." I looked up at him, startled by the sudden shift in his demeanor. "You have? What have? You found Holmes?" He sat up straighter, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the table. "The final clue, Watson. It's been staring us in the face all along, but I failed to see it for what it truly was." I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "What do you mean? What clue?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he began to speak, his words sharp and methodical. "We've been focusing on Harrow, on his escape, on the people he's manipulated. But the key to this entire case isn't Harrow's movements or his escape, it's the letter. I felt a flash of recognition. The letter from Clara? Precisely, Holmes replied. Clara's letter wasn't just a message about fear, Watson. It was a map, a key. She wasn't just afraid of Harrow. She was afraid of something else entirely, something she thought she could control. And she left us that clue, hidden within her words. I sat back, trying to piece together the fragments of Holmes's deduction. The letter had seemed so simple at first. Clara had written it in the final days of her life, describing her fear of Harrow. But now, Holmes was suggesting that it was more than just a confession. It was a final warning. Holmes stood and began pacing the room, his mind clearly racing. Clara's letter was meant to be a guide, Watson, a way to steer us in the right direction. When she mentioned Harrow, she wasn't just naming the man who had terrorized her. She was giving us the final piece to the puzzle, the key to unlocking his motive. I watched Holmes with a mixture of awe and anticipation as his deductions began to take shape. The letter, he continued, was written not just to inform, but to reveal. Clara was the one person who had a clear understanding of Harrow's obsession. She knew him better than anyone, and she understood what he was after. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression intense. Harrow wasn't after Clara's life, Watson. He was after something much more valuable, something she had hidden away. I stared at Holmes, trying to grasp the full weight of his words. You think Clara had something? Something that Harrow wanted all along? Holmes nodded, his gaze unflinching. Exactly. And now we know what it is. The waltz. It took a moment for the significance of his words to fully hit me. The waltz? But how could a piece of music be worth something so important? What does it have to do with Clara's death? Holmes's eyes were alight with the excitement of discovery. The waltz, Watson, was not just a piece of music. It was a symbol, a message. Clara didn't just leave behind a letter. She left behind a legacy, a key to Harrow's entire past. The waltz was his connection to everything, his power, his manipulation, and his obsession with control. He paused as though gathering his thoughts. You see, Harrow was never just a man, driven by greed. He was driven by the need to possess something, something that he could control, something that could elevate him. Clara's connection to the waltz was more than just a passing fancy. It was a way for Harrow to claim something that would solidify his power. I leaned forward, now fully engaged in Holmes's theory. And Clara, she realized what Harrow was after. That's why she left him. She knew that if Harrow got his hands on the waltz, it would give him even more power. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a theory well formed. Exactly, Watson. And that's why she ran. Harrow had threatened her, but what he really wanted was the waltz. The music was a symbol of his control over her. And now, he's willing to kill for it. I felt a chill settle over me. So Clara didn't just die because of Harrow's anger. She died because of what she held, and Harrow would stop at nothing to get it back. Holmes nodded, his expression grim. Indeed, and now we have to stop him before he can use it to his advantage. The waltz isn't just music, Watson. It's the final link in a chain that could give him everything he's ever wanted. Power, control, influence. I sat back, trying to process the enormity of the situation. Holmes, where do we go from here? What do we do now? Holmes paused for a moment, his fingers steepled together in that familiar pose. Now, Watson, we confront Harrow. We take away his last hope, the waltz. Once he realizes he no longer has it, he will be desperate. and in that desperation, he will make the mistake that will bring him down. I stood up, feeling the weight of the plan settle over me. We were closer than ever to solving the case, but I knew that this final confrontation would be the most dangerous yet. Harrow would stop at nothing to regain control, and he would use every last ounce of his cunning to protect the one thing that mattered most to him. "Let's end this, Holmes," I said, my voice steady but filled with anticipation. Holmes gave me a sharp nod. "Indeed, Watson, the game is nearly over, and when it is, we will finally have the truth." The night air was thick with anticipation as Holmes and I made our way back to the village square, the scene of so many key moments in this unfolding mystery. The fog had grown heavier with the passing hours, and the lanterns lining the cobbled streets flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows. Every footstep seemed muffled by the thick veil of mist, and the quiet was oppressive, as though the entire village was waiting for something to happen. Holmes had been resolute in his plan to confront Harrow one final time, to lay bare the truth that had been hidden for so long. And now, as we prepared for the culmination of our investigation, I could feel the weight of the past days pressing heavily upon us. The puzzle was nearly solved, but I knew that the final piece, Harrow, was still a dangerous, unpredictable element. His desperation could lead him to make a reckless move, and we would have to be prepared for anything. I glanced over at Holmes, who walked with his usual quiet confidence. His eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the shadows as if he were already anticipating the next move, calculating the angles, anticipating every possibility. The closer we came to the final confrontation, the more I marveled at his ability to remain focused, even when the stakes were at their highest. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "do you have any idea how this will end?" He didn't answer immediately, and for a moment I wondered if he had heard me at all. Then his voice, steady and calm as always, cut through the fog. "I know exactly how this will end, Watson," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The truth will come out, and Harrow will be caught. The only question left is how much more damage he will do before we stop him." I nodded, but I couldn't help the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. Harrow was not just a man. It had become clear that he was a symbol of something much larger, a force of manipulation and control that had poisoned everything in Ashcombe. Now, as we closed in on him, I realized that he wasn't just trying to escape. He was playing a game of survival, and he would stop at nothing to keep his secrets intact. As we neared the square, Holmes slowed his pace, and I instinctively followed his lead. There, standing near the fountain in the center of the square, was Evelyn Davis. She looked out of place in the eerie quiet of the night, her figure faintly illuminated by the lantern light. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously as she watched for any sign of movement in the shadows. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his tone polite but urgent. "Are you ready?" Evelyn nodded quickly, her face tense. "I've done as you asked, Mr. Holmes, but I still don't understand what's going to happen. What if he doesn't show up? What if I've made a mistake?" "You haven't made a mistake, Miss Evelyn," Holmes replied, his voice reassuring but firm. "The truth will come to light tonight. We've planned everything carefully. You have the key piece of the puzzle. All we need is for Harrow to believe it's true." Evelyn swallowed nervously, but she didn't hesitate. "I understand." I watched the two of them closely, feeling a growing unease. Evelyn had been at the heart of this mystery from the start, the one person who had been closest to Clara's fears. She had agreed to be part of this plan, to play the role of someone who had uncovered the truth about the waltz and Harrow's past. but I couldn't help but worry about her safety. Harrow was dangerous, and if he believed she had uncovered something he was trying to keep hidden, he wouldn't hesitate to silence her. "Holmes," I said quietly, "are we sure this is the right course of action? What if he doesn't fall for it? What if we're walking right into a trap?" Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Watson, we have no other choice. Harrow has already shown us that he is capable of anything. If we wait too long, if we give him more time to plan, we risk losing him entirely. This is our only chance to catch him. We can't afford to hesitate." I nodded, though the unease in my chest lingered. Holmes was right. We had no choice but to move forward. The trap was set, and now all we had to do was wait for Harrow to take the bait. We settled into place near the fountain, the night pressing in around us like a suffocating cloak. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as we waited. I watched Evelyn, who was standing just a few feet away, her eyes scanning the shadows. She was playing her part well, but I could see the fear in her face. She knew that what was about to happen would change everything. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. It was soft at first, a faint crunch of snow underfoot. But as the footsteps grew closer, I felt a chill creep up my spine. This was it. Harrow was here. Through the fog, a figure emerged, tall and posing, his face hidden in the shadows. The scar that marred his cheek was unmistakable, and I could feel the tension rise in the air as he stepped into the square. Harrow stopped in his tracks when he saw Evelyn standing by the fountain. His eyes narrowed, scanning her figure as if trying to determine if she was the one he had been waiting for. There was no sign of recognition, no flicker of surprise, just cold calculation. He had expected this. "Evelyn." Harrow's voice was low, almost a growl. "I should have known it would come to this." Evelyn stood her ground, her face pale but resolute. "You never thought I'd find out, did you, Harrow?" she said, her voice trembling slightly but carrying the weight of truth. "But I know what you've been hiding. I know about the waltz. I know about your past, and now you can't hide from it anymore." Harrow's expression shifted, a flicker of panic crossing his face for the briefest moment. But he quickly regained his composure, his lips curling into a tight smile. "You think you know everything, don't you? But you still don't understand. You never will." Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's over, Harrow. The truth is out. You've been manipulating everyone, hiding behind your lies. But now the game is finished." Harrow's eyes locked onto Holmes, his face twisting with rage. "You've made a mistake, Holmes. You don't know what you're dealing with. You think you've won? You think you've caught me? You're wrong." Before anyone could react, Harrow turned and made a swift move toward the alleyway behind the square. But Holmes was ready. He had anticipated Harrow's attempt to escape, and within seconds the figure of Harrow was blocked by the constable and his men, who had been waiting for this moment. Harrow's expression changed from fury to defeat as he realized the trap had been sprung. He was cornered, his escape thwarted. Holmes stepped forward, his face a mask of cold triumph. "Your game is over, Harrow," Holmes said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You've lost." As Harrow was taken into custody, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The case had come to its end, and the pieces had finally fallen into place. But even as I stood there, watching the villain being led away, I knew that this victory was bittersweet. The darkness that Harrow had brought to Ashcombe would linger long after he was gone. Holmes turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "It's over, Watson. The truth has been revealed, and justice will be served." I nodded, feeling the weight of the case lift from my shoulders. But as we walked away from the square, I couldn't shake the feeling that there would always be more mysteries to solve, more puzzles to unravel. For Holmes, the work was never truly finished, and for me, that was what made it all worthwhile. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The village of Ashcombe, which had been the stage for so many dark and tangled moments, was now eerily quiet in the aftermath of Harrow's capture. The constable's office, once a place of uncertainty and fear, now felt oddly serene as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Holmes, though still as focused as ever, seemed lighter, as though the weight of the case had lifted ever so slightly. But his mind, ever the intricate maze, was still buzzing with the final details, the truth we had long had. We sat together in the small room, the faint glow of a single oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. Holmes, though outwardly calm, was deep in thought, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. I, on the other hand, was restless. The events of the last few days had left me with more questions than answers. Even though Harrow had been apprehended, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had yet to hear the full story, that the truth was still hidden beneath layers of deception. Holmes looked up from his thoughts, his gaze locking with mine. "It's over, Watson," he said, his voice measured but certain. "We've captured Harrow. The case is solved." I raised an eyebrow, my skepticism evident. "But is it really, Holmes? We've uncovered so much about Harrow's manipulation, his connections, but I can't help but feel that there's more to this. There's still something we haven't seen." Holmes's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're right to be suspicious, Watson. As usual, you're a step ahead of me." I blinked in surprise. "You mean to say you haven't revealed everything? But we have Harrow in custody. We know what he's done." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he fixed his gaze on me. "Yes, we know what Harrow has done, but not why he did it, not the full extent of his plan. Harrow wasn't working alone, Watson. He was just the puppet, not the puppeteer." I felt a cold shiver run through me as Holmes's words began to sink in. "You mean there was someone else, someone pulling the strings all along?" Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing with the weight of the realization. "Exactly. Harrow wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn in a much larger game. And now that we have him, it's time to reveal the true orchestrator." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "Who is it, Holmes? Who else is involved?" Holmes's gaze sharpened as he began to speak, his voice steady and deliberate. "The true mastermind behind everything, behind Clara's death, behind Harrow's manipulation, was none other than Dr. Carrington." I stared at Holmes, shocked by the name. Dr. Carrington? But he was one of the first people we spoke to. He's been in the background this whole time. "Are you saying he's been pulling the strings all along?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Carrington was the key we had missed, Watson. He has been behind the scenes, quietly orchestrating the entire affair. Harrow was merely the instrument, the one who carried out the dirty work. But Carrington, with his influence and knowledge, was the true architect of Clara's death." I sat back, trying to process what Holmes was telling me. Dr. Carrington had seemed like a benign figure, an innocent bystander caught in the web of the mystery. But now, with the full scope of the case revealed, I saw that he was anything but innocent. his motives, his connections. They all pointed to a man who had been willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goals. "How did you figure this out, Holmes?" I asked, still stunned by the revelation. Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of having solved the puzzle. "It was the waltz, Watson. The key to everything was Clara's connection to that music. But it wasn't just the waltz itself. It was the man who composed it." I blinked in confusion. "The composer? What does that have to do with Dr. Carrington?" Holmes's smile widened. Dr. Carrington wasn't just a Dr. Watson. He was a musicologist, a man with a passion for rare and forgotten pieces of music. He knew about the waltz. He knew exactly what it was, and more importantly, he knew what it could mean. Clara's connection to the waltz wasn't a coincidence. She had stumbled upon something Carrington had spent years trying to locate. When she found it, Carrington knew he couldn't let her live. The waltz held the key to a powerful legacy, one that Carrington couldn't afford to let slip away. I felt a chill as Holmes's words began to form a clearer picture in my mind. The waltz wasn't just a piece of music. It was a symbol of power, a key to something far greater than we had realized. And Dr. Carrington, with his expertise in music and his hidden ambitions, had been the one to seek it out. "So, Carrington was after the waltz," I said slowly, piecing the details together. "But why go through all this trouble? Why manipulate Harrow? Why kill Clara? What was he hoping to achieve?" Holmes's expression grew more serious. Carrington's motivations were rooted in his desire for control. The waltz wasn't just a song, it was a composition tied to an influential family, one that had once wielded great power in Europe. The piece was thought to have been lost, but Clara's discovery of it set off a chain of events. Carrington knew that if he could get his hands on the waltz, it would restore his place in society, elevate him to a position of power that no one could challenge. The death of Clara was a necessary sacrifice to protect his secret. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized the full extent of Carrington's manipulation. He had used Harrow, used Evelyn, used Clara, all for his own gain. He had been willing to kill to achieve his goals, and now that Harrow had been captured, the only thing left was to confront Carrington himself. Holmes's eyes darkened with resolve. Carrington believed he had won Watson. But now that we know the truth, he will have no more room to maneuver. We'll expose him for what he is. I nodded, understanding the gravity of what Holmes was saying. The truth had finally been revealed, and it was even darker than we had imagined. Dr. Carrington, the man we had thought to be a benign figure in the background, was the true mastermind behind Clara's death and Harrow's manipulation. Holmes stood, his posture straightening with the finality of his words. "It's time to confront him, Watson. We've caught Harrow, but now we must deal with the true architect of this tragedy. Carrington will pay for his crimes." As we made our way to Carrington's residence, the fog seemed to lift slightly, as if the village itself was releasing the breath it had been holding. The game was over, and the truth had come to light. The final confrontation was at hand. The night was heavy with tension as Holmes and I approached the residence of Dr. Carrington, the man who had manipulated everyone and everything to serve his dark ambitions. It felt as though the very air around Ashcombe was thick with anticipation, like the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion to unfold. The fog, which had blanketed the streets for so many days, had begun to clear, leaving only the occasional mist clinging to the rooftops, as if nature itself was preparing for the storm to pass. Holmes walked ahead with his usual air of calm certainty, though I could see the fire of determination in his eyes. He had known all along that this was where the trail would lead. I, on the other hand, felt a quiet storm brewing within me. The unraveling of this case had revealed a truth darker than I could have imagined. And the person responsible, Dr. Carrington, was someone I had once thought innocent, a man whose motivations now seemed as twisted as the very crimes he had committed. We reached the front door of Carrington's estate, a large imposing building that seemed to have been built for someone of great influence. The walls, adorned with ivy and stone, gave the impression of a man who valued both prestige and privacy. There was no sign of movement within, but we both knew that Carrington was there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Holmes paused before the door, his fingers lightly brushing the brass knocker. He seemed to hesitate for only a moment, and then, with a decisive motion, he gave it a sharp knock. The sound echoed through the silent night, reverberating against the cold walls of the house. The waiting had come to an end. Now it was time for the truth to emerge. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Dr. Carrington himself. His face was pale, and his expression unreadable, though I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes as he saw us standing before him. "Holmes," Carrington said, his voice tight with barely concealed disdain. "I should have known it would be you." Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "Dr. Carrington, it's over. We know everything. We know about the waltz, the murders, and the part you played in all of it." Carrington's eyes flickered, but he remained composed, though the slightest tremor in his hands betrayed his calm demeanor. "You think you've uncovered the truth, Holmes? You're mistaken. The things you don't understand, the forces at play here, are beyond your comprehension." Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, his eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had already seen the outcome. "You've made the mistake of underestimating us, Carrington. We've been watching you for a long time, piecing together your lies. The game is up." Carrington stepped back slightly, his hands subconsciously resting on the edge of the door. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice taking on a hint of desperation. "This isn't just about Clara or Harrow. It's about something much larger. You can't stop it. No one can." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his tone cold. "We've already stopped you, Carrington. The waltz, the one thing you've been fighting for, is no longer yours. You've lost." For a moment, there was silence between us, the weight of those words hanging in the air. Carrington's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear. But I could see something else in his eyes, a recognition that, despite all his manipulations, his plans had unraveled. He was no longer in control. "You have no idea what you've just done," Carrington said, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "You think you've solved the puzzle, but you haven't. The waltz, it's just the beginning. There's so much more at stake here, Holmes. You can't even begin to comprehend the power behind all this." Holmes stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "I've seen enough, Carrington. I know what you've done, and I know why you did it. But it ends here. There's no more room for secrets, no more games." Carrington's lips curled into a twisted smile, as if he were mocking Holmes's words. "You think I'm afraid of you, that you've won. The game was never about the waltz. The waltz was just a piece in a much larger puzzle. And now that it's in your hands, you'll never understand its true power." Holmes's voice grew sharper, his patience wearing thin. "You're wrong, Carrington. The truth was never about the waltz. It was about control. And now that control belongs to the people you've manipulated, not you. Carrington's face darkened with a mixture of fury and defeat. He knew, just as Holmes did, that there was no way out now. The game was over, and he had lost. There would be no more power, no more manipulation. All his efforts, all the lives he had destroyed, had led to this moment. His exposure. Holmes turned to me, his expression resolute. "Watson, it's time. We have all the evidence we need. Carrington's actions, his motivations, everything is laid bare." I nodded, stepping forward. "Dr. Carrington, you are under arrest for the murder of Clara Davis, for your involvement in Harrow's crimes, and for your role in the manipulation and deceit that has haunted Ashcombe. You will face justice for your actions." Carrington stood motionless, his face a mask of defiance. But there was no escape. The truth had been revealed, and his plans were in tatters. "You may think you've won," Carrington said, his voice cold and filled with venom, "but you haven't. You don't know the true power that lies beneath it all. You'll see soon enough." Holmes turned to the constable who had been waiting quietly behind us. "Take him away," Holmes ordered. "Ensure that the full extent of his crimes is known. The truth will be made clear." As the constables escorted Carrington out of the house, I could feel the weight of the case lifting from my shoulders. The tension that had gripped us for so long was finally starting to ease. The mystery had been solved, and the truth had come to light. Holmes stood silently, watching Carrington being led away, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned to me, his eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "It's over, Watson," Holmes said softly. "We've uncovered the truth, and now justice will be served." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over me. The storm had passed, and Ashcombe would finally find peace. But I knew that, for Holmes, there would always be another mystery, another puzzle to solve. And I would be there, as always, at his side, ready to face whatever came next.